everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar from the AUR Research and Education Foundation Series grant. Tonight, we are extremely lucky to have a fantastic speaker and a wonderful mentor in Dr. Carolyn Meltzer speaking to us about difficult conversations. And I know that this is a topic that everyone is very eager to hear because it is so important for all of us in our daily lives. Just as a reminder for those of you who may not have joined this webinar series in the past, this is now our third in our series of a grant that was funded by the AUR R&E Venture Grant. And it's titled, Where's Waldo? Helping Mid-Career Faculty Stand Out from the Crowd. And the purpose of this grant really is to help mid-career faculty understand very important career decisions that they need to make, provide them with some skills and some resources that they probably don't have in their everyday life, and really just focus more on the mid-career faculty in terms of providing them with things that they will find helpful as they are navigating this really challenging part of their career. The purpose of this grant, again, is to develop and implement a curriculum targeted at those mid-career faculty, and it's a multi-part grant. This is part of it, which is the webinar series. It's approximately one a month, and this is open to all AUR members. And so thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. We're also going to provide to all AUR members a reading list of books and articles that we think are very helpful for personal and career development as you navigate this stage of your career. We're going to provide to everyone curated YouTube videos on different productivity topics to help you be very effective so that you can spend time focusing on things you need to do to be successful in your career. And then the second part is the small group development, which will have an application process, and hopefully the application will go out in the next week or so. So please be on the lookout for that. And that's going to consist of all of what I've just mentioned, in addition to a Coursera coursework that we will do together as a group in this small group setting. There will be research and writing mentorship, CV analysis, and things like finding out personal gaps and providing some guidance on how you can fill those in to continue along your development. We'll also have virtual journal clubs. So now it gives me great pleasure to take right from the breaking headlines. I stole this from Twitter, I will unabashedly say that, to announce our tonight's speaker, Dr. Carolyn Meltzer, who really truly needs no introduction. Many of you know her from all of her amazing work on equity and development and just so many things. She's a phenomenal NIH-funded researcher. She's been the chair of Emory for 16 years, I believe, is that correct?
Yes.
And was the associate dean there for faculty development. And as of, 3 hours ago, has just been announced as the dean of the Keck School of Medicine. So congratulations, it is incredibly well-deserved, phenomenal ambassador for us as a specialty and as women. And so I thank you so much for spending your time with us tonight. And I can't wait to hear your lecture on this important topic. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow you to take over. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Catanzano. I absolutely just love this venture, the venture grant mission and the framework you've set up. I think it's so important. And mid-career is a time that has specific needs to it and is often overlooked. So I'm hoping that my slides are sharing. Just double check. Does that look good? Oops. All right, so we're talking about difficult conversations. So I thought I'd put a soothing background because I know difficult conversations makes us all a little bit, cringy. And particularly at my transition in my career, I've had to have a lot of difficult conversations lately with my beloved colleagues. So let's talk about that and sort of dissect it a bit. You know, it's hard to separate out having difficult conversations, which is the basic skills of communicating in our complex matrix systems. And when we don't get it right, consequences ensue. So, over the next half hour or so, I want to sort of talk about communication and conflict styles and strategies a little bit, talk about perception, because often difficult conversation and conflict arises from differences in perception of a situation, and that kind of snowballs into a breakdown in communication. Talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls. I feel like I've been through every one of these again and again, and this is not always easy stuff. The complexity of power dynamics, and that also plays into not only the hierarchy of medicine, but also some of the issues of bias and who has power in an organization and who feels valued, and what is permissive of some folks in terms of professionalism and behavior, and just the importance of debriefing and continuous learning with these skills, as well as all leadership skills. So what I always tell new leaders, and I'm using the word leader broadly, we are all leaders, whether you have a title or not. We're informal leadership and influence is the most effective way for actually getting things done, regardless of whether there's a title associated with it. So, I always say to new leaders, the most important thing you can do initially, and that's, whether it's a new leadership role or a new institution or a new program that you're engaged in or a new committee, is to build trusted relationships. People need to know that you're just not there to be transactional, to tell them what you need, but to listen what's important to them and to build that trust bank. Integrity is the basis of all professional relationships that are effective. So, when I think about what are the characteristics of building trust and the pieces of that, it's this sort of generosity of spirit, where you are curious about the other individual. You want to support what they're interested in, not just because of mutualism, but because of wanting to embrace a collegial and trusting environment. Integrity, trust is easily lost, difficult to regain. So always bringing your authenticity to the table. Competence, being clear, I think, about what we're good at, what we're not so good at. That needs to be part of the process of building trust. Not to underestimate or overestimate, where your skill set is in the technical part of your field, but to say, here's what I can bring to the table, and this is what I hope to learn from you. And reliability. So if you say you're going to do something, you got to do it. Now, when we think about leadership overall, and we can talk about, leadership dynamics forever, and I promise not to this evening, but leadership has changed so much in terms of how it is affected in successfully in our matrixed leadership environments and our matrixed reporting environments. So transformational leadership, where teams really are effective together, is really based on those relationship, interpersonal dynamics, social awareness, and relationship management. So there's very little that a leader can say, I want everybody to do this, and they're going to do it. That's not, those aren't the types of leadership that are successful anymore, and certainly don't work well in complex environments. A lot of the work that I do in the faculty affairs area is often when perceptions differ. So somebody says, gee, that person, really wasn't nice to me. They didn't respect me. But what was it? Did you have a trusted relationship to begin with? Communication style and approach and venue really matters. If I know someone really well, I can text them without emojis and they'll understand what I mean. You have to put in the face-to-face time to develop the relationship so that there isn't a misperception. Now, face-to-face seems to be mask to mask or Zoom to Zoom these days, but we work around that. Understanding cultural norms. So I made a big mistake once. I had a senior faculty member I hired, and I like a more flattened hierarchy. I tend to be more informal. He would always call me Dr. Meltzer, and I said, please call me Carolyn. You know, we're peers and you're a senior person in the field. And so, you know, the next time we'd meet, he'd say, call me Dr. Meltzer. And again, I said, please, I insist, call me by my first name. And he was from a cultural background that was intrinsically hierarchical, and he felt more comfortable that way. So the answer he said to me was, okay, I will call you Carolyn, but I'd rather call you Dr. Meltzer. So I realized I was imposing my comfort zone on his cultural norm. So a cultural humility perspective is always helpful. You know, the situation, whether it's a stressful time, you know, there are times I really have to sit back and say, I can't be objective about dealing with this issue right now because I know there's a part of it that's pushing my buttons and making me emotional and is reminiscent of some other difficult conflict. Power differential, really important. We'll get to that. Age and, you know, generation, how we like to be, have our communication, how formal, informal, and of course, gender and bias issues, systemic bias issues. The pitfalls in communication, so that emotionality. I know that there are times when something, I will feel like I've had a conversation before, I didn't get anywhere, and now God, I can't believe we have to have this again. And I've got to make sure I check myself and say, okay, I got to chill. I can't approach this conversation now or this communication that's important to me and important to the other person if I don't, if I have emotionality. I won't be able to approach it as objectively as I need to. Oh, assumptions about intent. So how often do we find ourselves where someone says something and we interpret and then describe that behavior, not as the behavior, but, oh, they meant to put me down. They meant to devalue me. They weren't respectful. So thinking about assumptions of intent, trying to take that out. Defensiveness and blaming framework rather. And there are ways to avoid this. One very difficult conversation that people have learned is about vaccination status, and how that can really set up defensiveness if two colleagues disagree on that. Distraction by past woes. So we all have issues we're sensitive about, and those can pop up with the right cues. Business schools used to talk about the sandwich approach, and still do to some degree, where you want to have a difficult conversation with someone and you say, you know, I really, you know, you're just great and you've been doing some great things lately. And by the way, you know, I was concerned about this thing that came up, but you're just terrific and we'll meet again. So, and I'm exaggerating here, but this sort of sandwich of the difficult piece or the concern or the constructive criticism in the middle of two nice things. What happens with that is it feels better for the person delivering that. But the perception is often, oh, I didn't understand that middle part, but you know, so-and-so said I was terrific. So, and the message is just lost. This isn't for every communication. We have a lot of casual communication, or more automatic communication during the day. What we're talking about here is communication that's really important, either difficult or crisis oriented, or conflict, emerging out of conflict. So really preparing, listening actively, and that takes that's not waiting for someone to answer so that you can hop in with your next point, but really listening. And that takes enormous leader energy and emotional energy. Focusing on the problem and not the person. I found the worst thing I can do in a difficult communication is say, when you did this, but rather to say, I know we had an uncomfortable communication the other day, and I just wanted us to look at this and sort of reinterpret it together so that there aren't misunderstandings, but not about the person. I don't know if folks have heard of the concept of appreciative inquiry. And this is a whole subfield of leadership, but I really like it in certain circumstances because often when we're communicating about difficult problems, we sort of get stuck on what's not working. Appreciative inquiry arises from taking the approach that let's think about when something that was similar to this issue we're dealing with, that everything worked really well. What did success look like at one point? Maybe it was just the team came together on a specific project and everything went really well and everybody got along and the product was terrific. So saying, let's look back at that situation. What were the elements of that made it successful? And could we take some of that learning and apply it to where we're stuck right now on the current challenge? Clarity. And this gets to communication styles. I may think I'm being clear, but if somebody is used to receiving communication in a very direct manner, and I may not be as direct, or I may be, sort of suggesting something, then that message may not get across. And I'll say, I was very clear. I had this conversation. And the other person, may later say, oh, I don't really know what she was talking about. But it seemed like everything was fine. Empathy. Boy, is that something we need right now. In this time where everybody's tired, feeling isolated, it's hard to have the emotional energy to put yourself in someone else's situation and to really think about what would I do? How would I feel if I was in my colleague's shoes? But that is really important to practice, exercise. It's part of emotional intelligence that really helps us to understand the emotional energy of a situation and how we can move it to the next step. That is even more challenging with Zoom. Being face-to-face, reading body language, sensing tension in a room can be really hard through the communication means that we rely on now. And even if we're face-to-face, if we're masked, that sort of hides a lot of facial expression tension that we might perceive and react to and try to modulate our approach. Paying attention to those nonverbal cues. If somebody's breaking their pencil in 7,000 pieces while while you're having a conversation, that may signal some tension. And humor is a wonderful thing when used appropriately, but it can certainly help ease tension to try to gently inject humor if the situation seems appropriate. The most powerful question I have learned in my environment, and I learned it from some colleagues who practice this, ended every meeting with, is there anything I can do for you? Which the first time I heard it, I thought, wow, did I hear that right? What do you mean? Is there anything you can do for me? But that can be very powerful for further solidifying relationships, building that empathy and letting someone know that you really want to know how you can support their goals. Forms of communication. And this can be really tough. There's so many ways we can communicate. And I always used to say, for difficult conversations, there's no substitute for in person. And I made the mistake at the farmer's market last week of asking the vendor, you know, were these apples sweet? And she said, read the sign, which I didn't take as really a very collegial approach. So, you know, in-person communication, there's the details, read my blog. We have to communicate often in multiple ways. Phone's the next best thing, or Zoom, but you lose some cues. If you have a good relationship, phone can be just fine. You know, then you go to formal written, which we almost never do, but written electronic, email, depends how you write emails. Some people write emails as if there's no punctuation and there's no connecting words, and there's not a lot of context in them. And text typically even less. That's why emojis were developed. So we could signal to someone we were kidding or smiling or happy or felt their sadness. And social media, I wouldn't use that for difficult conversations. You know, we're certainly in a multi-generational workforce where people are comfortable with different kinds of communication. And often as leaders, we have to communicate in different ways and also understand if there are words that may push buttons, if there's concerns that people have, if there needs to be. So I will give you an example. When I first moved to the South, and I am a New Yorker, that I realized it isn't an acceptable thing to just walk into a conversation and say, hey, by the way, could you do this? That is not appropriate in the culture of the region of the country. It is, how are you today? How are the kids? It is showing that relational piece first. So taking all that into consideration. I wanted to spend a few moments talking about conflict. So I don't know if has anyone done the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument, or the TKI? I think it's okay, great, Dr. Robbins. Yeah, I think it's a really helpful tool. There are other tools out there, but it has really made me think and try to think about the conflict that I encounter in terms of what is my default mode, and then when do I need to use other approaches to resolve or address a conflict. So what's my default conflict style? I have found that a very prevalent conflict style is avoidance. And avoidance can be terrific. So, you know, if I'm in the supermarket and I bump my cart against, you know, if someone bumps their cart against mine and they don't say, I'm sorry, and they just go off, well, I could make a big deal of it, but why? I don't know the individual. They're not important. That relationship isn't important. And the outcome isn't important. So what if they say, I'm sorry? I mean, who cares? It's not worth putting emotional energy into that communication. And we all know people who will create a big conflict out of something minor that's meaningless. But when avoidance is overused in the workplace, it can be really destructive. So how do I know, what my uh, uh, default is, and how do I take into consideration that it may not be the best mode for each situation? So the way this framework works is you think about what is the relationship, how important is it, and the outcome or the task. So let's say buying a car. You might have bought a car from the same dealer for years and you have a relationship, but most of the time that's transactional. So it isn't something where um, the relationship's important, but you want to get the lowest price. So you got to think about, that matrix. How important is the relationship? How important is the outcome? So we think about some of those. Avoidance, I don't care about the relationship. This person bumped my cart, don't know I'm no harm done. I'm going to avoid conflict. I'm just going to turn the other cheek. That seems to be the most efficient way of dealing with it. What about if it's a really important relationship and the outcome isn't important to you? Maybe it's your partner wants to go to this particular restaurant. You kind of want to go to the other, but you don't really care that much. And that relationship's really important to you. Important relationships are the one you have with your supervisor. If your supervisor wants you to do something that you don't feel strongly about, you're just going to do it. Accommodate. It's different if the outcome is really important. What about if the outcome or task is super important, but you don't care about the relationship? So what are situations like that? Maybe it is the car dealer. Cars is pretty expensive. If I save some money, that's really important to me. And the relationship I don't care about. There are other times when something is really at stake. Safety, quality, an emergency situation where you may compete because you have to get into the task or outcome is that important. Compromising. So compromising is in this this sort of nebulous space in the middle. Compromising is what we often think about when we think about negotiation. Because, I think you owe me $100 and you think you owe me $50. So we say, okay, let's settle it at $75. That's a compromise. That's sort of splitting the baby, meeting in the middle. Does that work all the time? What if something isn't easily split? You can't say, I think we should invest in our strategic plan to build a program of cardiac imaging. Somebody else says, no, I think we should really put in, those dollars to be the best in our MSK imaging. You don't do half of them, half of each. You don't build half a building. So when something is really important, it's a big task, big project, relationships are important. The collaborative approach where you think outside the box and say, how can we work on this together and really put time? And this is where task forces come in and committee. You don't want to do a task force for everything, but the big projects, that's where you want to put that sort of team decision-making and collaborative style forward. So my favorite definition of conflict, because I think when we hear the word conflict, we want to hide under the couch. But I love this. Conflict exists when one person has a need of another and that need is not being met. So you sort of picture your colleagues walking around and they are frustrated with something and maybe you could help, or maybe someone can help you with yours. But, just thinking of it as an unmet need and not something that is hostile, warlike, battlefield imagery. So in planning for that difficult conversation, it's another area where we get anxiety and we just feel dread and I don't want to do it and I'd rather avoid. I like to try to reframe that. So yeah, I'd rather avoid it, but the price of avoiding it is toxicity, breakdown in teamwork, people not rowing in the same direction, and reframing in a positive light. How can I approach this for a really good opportunity, for a good outcome? Maybe it's just improving your relationship with an important colleague. Maybe the task isn't that important, but it is the relationship. And taking time to refocus. This is something I have to work on. We tend to go from meeting to meeting, and then we go, oh yeah, this is a really important one. Where was I? So if the meeting is important, involves difficult conversation or really important communication, I need to sit and focus for a moment before. How am I going to start it? How am I going to approach it? What will be my mood? Am I setting the tone? If I walk in all like, hey, what's going on? It may be seen as trivializing the issue we came together, to be too bright or, dismissive. If I'm too somber, it may make everybody tense. So refocusing tone, emotionality, and how to start in an open way. Again, focus on the issue, not the individual. Actively listening to that person as they explain, and you try to suppress the assumptions that you might make. And empathy is the most important tool you can bring to a difficult conversation. The most difficult conversation I have ever had to have in the workplace involved an employee who was embezzling funds. And you would think that would be really straightforward, you're fired. It was a really difficult conversation. And I had to really bring empathy to it, because this person had real personal problems that led them to a place they would have never gone before. And it was really, really difficult. And always reflecting and learning. So it's important to have trusted colleagues if they're there with you, to say afterward, how did I handle that? And not just for platitudes, but could I have said something different? Could I have approached it better? It's certainly possible we try to do that with ourselves, but it's good to have a trusted colleague who will be honest with you and say, oh, you really handled the opening well, but I could see tension on, the recipient when you talked about this, and maybe you could have stopped and listened for a moment. So always learning from these situations. Nobody is a world's expert on difficult communication. So I will stop here and leave you with a quote from James Baldwin. You have to decide who you are and force the world to deal with you, not its idea of you. And that may sound paradoxical compared to what we just talked about, but I think it's sort of involved in what we just talked about. All right, glad to stop sharing and to turn to our moderators.
Thank you so much for an excellent presentation on difficult conversations. I think this is something all of us can learn from every single day, all of the time. I would encourage the participants to place your questions into the Q&A box or into the chat box. In the meantime, I do have a question, and it has to do with emotions. I think this is something that I struggle with often. Do you have specific strategies that you use to decouple the emotion from the difficult conversation?
Yeah, I definitely have had that struggle and, still do, but to a lesser degree. Once, as you get older in leadership, you sort of experience a lot of difficult conversations and don't take it as personally. Gee, somebody misunderstood me. How could they? This really pushes my buttons. It's, it gives you sort of that context of, everybody has a different perspective. I just own mine and I can try to understand this person better. But for me, it's always about waiting until I can push the emotionality down a little bit, process it in my head, go for a walk, talk about the issue with someone else in a safe space, and kind of dissipate the emotionality a little bit, and then try to approach it from a more steady point of view. But the worst thing I know for me is to just go in and have the conversation if I'm not in the right emotional state. And sometimes as a leader, you have to say, look, I know this is a difficult issue for everybody, just sensing the emotion in the room. Like, let's just take a break and let's reschedule, and maybe we'll have some smaller group conversations before that. So yeah, emotions can really take a difficult conversation and make it worse.
How do you handle it if someone won't let you do that? There are always going to be those individuals who feel the need to really address whatever the elephant in the room is at the moment and not to let you take that step back. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that can be tough. And it does depend sometime on the relationship with the individual, and to say, hey, no, I really think, or sometimes it's about letting that individual vent. If you're the only other person in the room, it's less likely to cause damage to a team if you just say, okay, I know you need to get this out. Let me hear you. And then we're going to stop and I'm going to ask you some questions, and then we're going to decide how to approach this with the team. And people need a chance to vent sometimes, and especially now.
Absolutely.
I have two questions that I'm excited to ask. The first one is, when you meet different kind of people in your variety of leadership roles, is there like something that quite commonly happens where you're like, geez, this is such a rookie mistake. I wish people wouldn't do this when they're having this critical conversation with me, because once you do this, you're not going to get a whole lot out of me. And, I wish you would learn. That's the first. And then second, we're all surrounded by individuals who just are smooth operators. They just know how to get more out of their leaders, and they're just so much better compared to maybe some non-experienced ones at managing up. And if you could just describe maybe somebody who comes to mind and how they do it and how they're able to get more out of you.
Yeah, so maybe I'll answer that backward with the second question. It's rather intriguing.
Okay.
Because you can sense to a point someone who is trying to get something out of you, as opposed to really investing in your relationship and then having authentic conversations. And often those people think, oh, I just come in with all this flattery and, I can get anything I want. And, you just, most of us see through that and you kind of dismiss it. Okay. And you're gracious back and over complimentary back, because that's the nature of your communication style, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to give that person more. I had a colleague once who was, had that kind of way, a very gracious way about him, but it was very inward facing. And while you'd meet him once and you'd say, oh, that's, he's so polished. And I'd say, yeah, polished, but there's always an agenda. And I just always wait for the agenda. And then he came in once and said, I'm doing so well and you've been so complimentary. I want a leadership role. And I said, you're not ready because it's all about you still. And of course, I didn't deliver it that abruptly. But, reading between the lines. And again, those things are hard if we're not face to face. Now, I'm trying to remember your first question. Your first question was about rookie
Easy
mistakes.
mistakes that we can avoid in
Yeah.
crucial conversations.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many. I think trying to understand the other person that you're presenting to. So one thing that I always think is a rookie mistake is when someone says, oh, you talk about an issue and you say, well, I think we had this, we were probably approached it not as objectively about the issue and from a cultural humility standpoint, understanding each other's perspectives. And the worst answer to that is, I am who I am. And this is the way I'm not hiding. This is the way I am. I'm very direct. And to me, that's disrespectful. Yeah, we all have our default style, but if your style is difficult for someone else, your default style, then as a leader, you need to modify it a little bit. The answer is not, I am who I am. Yes, we need to be authentic, but that doesn't mean we can't modify the way we communicate to be more empathetic, understanding, and from the other person's perspective.
Thank you.
Like we have a question in the Q&A box now, and the question is, how do you approach the toxic member of a group, someone that is causing conflict and bringing down morale? Do you find that they know? That they are being toxic?
I think sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they think it's a crusade. I'm really just arguing for what my group needs, but then everybody in the group is cringing because everything is so negative from that individual. Yeah, we did a whole session at site of chairs of radiology, academic radiology departments once on the toxic faculty member, because it can really be a strain on morale, as you say. Ignoring that person doesn't always work, but sometimes. So sometimes that individual will try to bait other people, send a really long email. Why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? And you don't always have to answer on this person's terms, especially if you've already been through an issue with them. And at some point, just talking to them about the behavior and the effect on others. And making it about, as a leader, if you have someone who reports to you who does become that really toxic individual, I mean, one, you need to understand, is this their usual behavior, or is this a cry for help that they're really burned out? And we've all seen stress behaviors, particularly the last couple of years, where people just kind of lose their inhibition and will act out in ways they don't. So sometimes it's cry for help, but if they've always been that way, then make it about performance and say, here's our standard that we all abide by in terms of respectful communication and respect for one another. And yeah, this isn't acceptable, the mode you're using. But these are tough. Toxic colleagues are really tough, but I've always thought that I can always help someone, mentor them, and sometimes you just can't. And I think especially early on in my leadership, I would keep working with someone beyond which others thought I should tolerate it. And then when you finally make a move and say, you know, you really should be moving on because we don't want to work in this kind of atmosphere, that everybody takes a sigh of relief and says, oh, finally, somebody did something. So these are complex issues usually.
So to kind of dovetail on that particular concept of, letting someone go and kind of pulling in the concept of clarity that you discussed and follow up, like, how do you sort of check for understanding in a non-demeaning way? And how do you suggest to document some of these conversations such that there is bi-directional agreement that what was discussed and what is documented is the same?
No, it's a great point, Dr. Robbins. We tend to greatly underdocument. So we'll have, a situation and then say, well, I dealt with it, or I think they got it and they're not going to act up again. And we think somehow documenting or note to file, or, once you have that communication, a note saying, I just want to make sure this is what we agreed to, and we're going to meet every month or something and make sure things are going well. We think that then sets up an adversarial relationship, but documentation is really important. There's always a leader who says, oh, I've handled all that. This person's great. There's nothing in the record. The next leader comes in and says, oh my goodness, none of this has really been dealt with. So that paper trail is really important, and writing those as objectively as possible. So it isn't so-and-so came in and they were abrupt but we had a discussion, this person asserted that X, Y, Z, I tried to explore why they felt that way, what their understanding was, how we could solve this together, and, just writing it as objectively as possible. And we agreed on, we're going to meet every week. We're going to, this person's agreed to go to a stress management workshop or get counseling, and we will follow up. And whether that counseling is work-related coaching that reports back, or whether it's confidential coaching for them, and then you just assess the individual in terms of the outcome that you see. So being really clear about those kinds of variables.
Just as a follow-up question on that, I think particularly early career leaders are always dancing the dances to when you should get HR involved and how much should you share with HR, because you don't want to put a faculty member who may be having a struggle personally into a position where they are now fearing for their jobs, and yet you do need to document and to make sure that you've done everything the institution requires. How do you draw that line as to when it's the right time to, at least test the waters with HR?
Yeah, and I think that can really vary from institution to institution. HR was, originally really developed for organizations to protect the employee and support the employee. Just the field has gone to be more an arm of management. So it can seem very threatening to bring in HR, as opposed to HR is there to support the successful outcome for the employee. So sometimes that can be weaponized. And if you bring in HR too early and say, I want this HR person to sit here in our conversation, that can be really off-putting and have things go down an adversarial standpoint. Sometimes it's easier to have someone who is your administrator or someone else who can witness, document, but isn't as threatening as HR, and calling HR to get advice about the situation before. So I never thought, before I became a chair, I did not realize how much time you will spend on the phone with HR and legal to get advice as a situation is evolving, not when it's all blown up. And they really appreciate that and can really give great advice without sort of being the face of the difficult conversation.
So, in the theme of mid-career faculty, one of the crucial conversation that always comes up in most of our careers is you're kind of, really mid-career, and you feel like the institution is not giving you the opportunities that you deserve. And
Mhm.
rightly or wrongly so, I think everybody feels that way at some
Yep.
point in their career. And you
Yep.
have to go and meet, your section chief, maybe even your chair to say, I'm losing patience here. I have skills that are underutilized. I have
Mhm.
positivity to bring in, but there are no opportunities.
Mhm.
And really, what you're trying to tell them delicately is that time's running out and I might look for
Mhm.
other opportunities. And I'm trying to be very nice here. How do you handle that kind of crucial conversation?
Yeah, and I would say from the mid-career person who is struggling with that, the the best way to approach it is just to make an appointment with your chair, your section chair, and say, I am coming to you for career development guidance. I want your opinion on how I go to the next step. Here's the skills I've worked on. Here's how the projects I've executed them on. Um, and get your advice. I'm thinking this could be a path. I might be interested in being a section chief. I might be interested in um, you know, a quality officer job. I might be, so letting that person know what you aspire to, I think really is helpful in asking their advice. Because if you come in and say, and I know you were just framing the issue,
Yeah,
of
yeah,
course, but if you come in and say, like, where's my leadership position?
yeah, yeah.
You always have to show that you're executing on that and what you can bring to, um, to the department or the division in terms of what the goals are and what, we're trying to get to. If somebody comes to my office and say, I was reading this strategic plan and I know there's an initiative around this, and I don't know if you know that I did this project. I'm wondering if I could be helpful as I think about my own career development trajectory.
Mhm.
So, kind of a meeting of the minds in terms of what could align with the leader's goal. Um, but also, and if your leader does not care about developing people, then you might want to go to a new place. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
We have two questions that pivot a little bit away from mid-career, but relate to one another. And they both of the questions deal with individuals who lack self-awareness. So how do you cope with the difficult employee who has a lack of insight to their own shortcomings? And maybe these are the people that play the victims, maybe these are the people that have poor performance but think otherwise of themselves. And how do you have a conversation with those individuals?
I mean, frankly, I struggle with those individuals because there isn't the leadership mindset of reflection, improvement, asking for feedback. They're sort of, I'm perfect and you just, told me someone has a problem with me. Well, that's their problem. Um, so that can be really difficult. I've had folks work with coaches and try to develop a little more insight with someone who's really trained to help with that skill set, to develop that skill set. Some people respond to that, but it is hard to teach someone insight if they intrinsically don't have it. And those are the people who often can really end up um, stepping all over others and being really difficult. So I saw Anne had.
That was in response to your answer, her
Oh,
emotional distress.
I mean, has anybody actually ever seen an individual who lacks total self-awareness actually turn over a new leaf with coaching? I personally haven't. I mean, it works for a while, but then they're back to.
Yeah, I mean, it is emotional intelligence. We know people who have no emotional intelligence. I mean, you can spot them a mile away, and those folks aren't going to develop insight and empathy and, a sense of community. But everybody has a varying degree of it. And, I've seen people who really tend to be very self-focused on, it's all about them, and it's, I'm terrific and everybody else is a problem. I've seen softening with coaches and an effort to ask and to then listen and then be surprised at feedback they get and try to learn from it. So it is a skill you can develop. If it's completely absent, you have no interest in it, it's not going to change, but we can always try.
But although on the positive side, I do know of at least two people who had exhibited that kind of behavior and they ended up leaving, but they actually found jobs in which they were a better fit and ended up happier. So that I have seen.
Yeah.
At least on the surface, they claimed they're happier.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, fit is important. I've had people say, well, what's all this touchy-feely stuff about have respect for one another and how we treat each other, and this isn't what I'm here for. They'd be much happier in a different environment.
How can you move them to recognize that? I think, especially for those people who really don't have the insight to realize they are not really working along the needs of the department. How do you help them to get to the point where they decide that maybe they would be better off somewhere else?
That is one of the difficult conversations. And I've certainly had those and said, you seem to be struggling with XYZ. I know this is, really important in terms of the way the department is run. Maybe you would be, I'm here to support your success. So, is there another kind of environment, whether it's here or elsewhere? I've had a couple of different responses to that kind of conversation. Someone who initially got angry that I would actually, suggest they should leave, and then really trying and saying, oh, well, no, I want to be successful here. And then realizing was also some expectations on their part as well. Oh, my dogs are barking. And sometimes I've seen it such that someone says, oh, I'm going to show them how valuable I am. And they get another offer and they say, I've got another offer. And I say, I wish you the best. Fantastic. And sometimes that is the best thing for that individual, the best thing for the department.
That's great. So it looks like we only have about a minute left. I think this has been a phenomenal session. Thank you so much for giving us your wisdom and your expertise. I have learned a ton. I love the idea of the appreciative inquiry. I'm going to go do some reading on it, and hopefully we'll add some to our repository of books for all of our grant recipients. Any final closing thoughts from any of the panelists or from Dr. Meltzer as we are closing the session?
No, I just want to reiterate to Dr. Meltzer that the first activity that she did after becoming the dean at USC was an AUR webinar, and that she should. So thank you
So
for
happy
that.
to spend this evening with you all. Delighted. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.